This last couple of days we have been practicing meditation, and we did a day of samatha practice and a day of vipassana practice. Samatha meditation is any meditation that is based on trying to stabilize the mind on a single object. Most commonly done in our tradition is meditation on the breath, and there are various ways of doing that as well. But there are other samatha meditations. One that's very prominent in the older texts is kasina meditation. It's meditation using a visual object like a colored disc or a bowl of water, stabilizing the mind on that. That type of meditation is difficult if you don't have a facility for visualizing, but if you have a facility for visualizing, it can be very powerful for stabilizing the mind. Ajahn Sumedho teaches not one of the traditional ones from the Visuddhimagga, but it works. It teaches a meditation on the inner sound. You find that kind of inner buzz is always present and use that as the object. So any object that's taken to make the mind still, samatha meditation has a lot of benefits. One that is mentioned by the Buddha in many places is a pleasant abiding here and now, the blameless pleasure divorced from the senses. So it's experiencing an entirely inward focused pleasure, a pleasant state of mind. It has a benefit of making the mind spacious and calm, which is very useful for then taking it on to vipassana. If the mind is stabilized and calm, then the vipassana becomes much, much easier. It also has benefit of broadening one's experience by allowing you to experience a level of mind that is beyond the sense desire realm. It has that kind of educative function of allowing you to experience a different state of mind, which then allows you to understand the ordinary mind better by contrast. By having seen something else, then it becomes more clear, more understandable, the ordinary mind that's entrapped in the sense realm. Now, vipassana meditation is the meditation that brings wisdom, and the idea of the vipassana meditation is to allow you to see reality as it actually is. There's a quality of mind called Yata Bhuta Jnana Dasana, the knowledge and vision of things as they are. So seeing things according to reality. It's difficult to see things according to reality when you're filtering everything through a self position, which is the default sort of mode that we're looking at everything with a kind of a agenda, what's in it for me, right? The mind is parsing reality according to what's desirable, what's useful, what's harmful, and so on. And it makes it difficult to clearly understand and see things in their own nature as they actually are. So what we try and do with the meditation is, first of all, simplify the externals. You find a quiet place and try and simplify the external life as much as possible so that there's very little to deal with. As long as you're embodied, there's always something to deal with, but try to simplify it as much as possible, and then just observe with a disciplined kind of introspection the stream of consciousness, what's passing before the mind. At each moment, the mind is taking an object. Whether you're meditating or not, this process is going on, one object after another. And all we're trying to do with the meditation is to make that fully conscious so that we can see things as they are. The struggle, the difficulty in doing vipassana is to work against the innate tendency of the mind to fall into the position of self-idea, self-interest, self-reference. That things arise to the mind. A thought is just a thought. A memory is just a particular kind of thought, and an image of things that no longer exist. But if we get caught in it, if we see that this is somehow important, it's relevant to me, I got to understand this, this is something I need to work with, then you're doing it from the point of view of identification. You're caught, you're lost in it. And it's no longer possible to see the phenomenon objectively. So there's one phrase that one of the Vipassana teachers used that I find very useful, is to say that Vipassana is all about the process, not the content. We shouldn't be overly interested in the content of our memories, our thoughts, our daydreams, our schemes, our fears. The content is not important. What's important is to see the process of remembering, of thinking, of fearing or scheming, to see that as a process, and to see it objectively and impersonally. Ultimately, that comes to seeing it as empty. When you see the phenomena as empty, then it's a great liberation to the mind. The mind is free, it's unfettered. And the knowing mind itself is also empty. So it's empty both ways. And you just see this as a process. Objects arising to the mind knows them, and they pass away back into the emptiness of which they consist. If you practice Vipassana diligently, then you go through various stages that have been very minutely discussed and mapped out, beginning with a very cursory list in the Majjhima Nikaya, that's in the Stagecoach Relay Sutta, where the Buddha gives the analogy of a king sending a message to another king. They have established a royal post road, so they get the message quickly. They change horses at every so many miles. There's another building and a stable, and they get fresh horses so they can gallop the whole way. And he says, just as this particular state of mind is not the goal, but it's a stage. Its purpose is to reach the next stage, and so on. It goes through the 7 stages. Then this got elaborated in the Visuddhimagga into 20-some stages, and discussed by dividing them up into sub-stages. And then more modern commentators like Mahasi Sayadaw and others have written lengthy books based on in the case of Mahasi Sayadaw, based on years of practice and teaching, observing others. And he's brilliant book, actually, The Progress of Insight, where he describes these various stages in detail. What happens to the mind if it goes through all these stages? It's like a learning experience. It learns different aspects of reality and how the mind works and the nature of the objects. And eventually it reaches a stage that's called equanimity about formations. And this is as far as you can go, as much as you can do by effort. You get to the stage of equanimity of formations, which is a very pleasant abiding here and now. And at that point, the meditation no longer feels like any kind of effort at all. And there's no sense of struggle. There's no sense of difficulty. There's no real sense that you're meditating. You're just sitting there. Mindfulness is perfect. You're not missing anything. The critical factor is that you're completely equanimous. The upekkha is very strong, so you're not shaken by anything that arises. You're neither overjoyed or thrown into fear or upset or elated. You're just sitting there pleasantly neutral in profound peace. And this is not itself awakening, but it is what could be called the jumping off place, the landing stage. From equanimity about formations, then realization of nibbana is possible, because the grip of samsara is so light at that point. But there's nothing that the meditator can do at that point but just sit there. And the process just continues of objects arising to the mind, but at some point the engagement of samsara becomes weak enough that the mind, as it were, jumps sideways. And instead of taking an object, it, in the words of the Buddhaghosa, it alights upon non-occurrence. And it has a realization of nibbana, the unconditioned. So that's what we're working towards with the meditation. There are many benefits to the meditation even before that point. By understanding the nature of mind and gaining objectivity toward the processes of mind and seeing them as empty, we gain a progressive liberation from the various kind of bondages of the mind. It's like greater mental health. The only completely sane individual is an arahant. Everyone else is in some way a bit more or less delusional. And mental states, mental processes can cause us suffering if we identify with them, if we don't see them as empty. But if they're seen as empty, then they have no power to cause us any distress. So all the kind of neuroses and miseries of the mind become as nothing. Anxieties and depressions and so on, they're all empty mind states. So then question often arises about meditation. Practical question is what kind of meditation to do, and when, and which sort, and so on. And generally what I tell people, if they're doing a daily practice and they only have a limited amount of time to meditate during the day, in my opinion, they're often better off doing samatha meditation, doing mindfulness of breathing, or some other samatha meditation, particularly if there's stress and conflict in the life. Because what you need is a break from that. You need to find spaciousness so that you can have some strength to deal with stuff. And vipassana is more difficult, and particularly if there's issues, conflicts, things going on, the Vipassana becomes hard and you end up just kind of wrangling with your mental states. Vipassana is most beneficial when you've got a stretch of time and you can do it for successively all day, or better yet, for over a retreat for many days. There's a process happening with the Vipassana that is makes it difficult to make progress if you keep breaking it off. It's like rubbing two sticks together to make a fire. That if you stop and take a break every time you get a bit weary, then you never get a spark. Yeah? So the ideal way to do Vipassana is just continuously, to do it all day and not take any breaks. It's the most effective way of doing it. If you're not in a situation where you've got a lot of difficulty or stress and you've got a little bit more time to meditate, then you can mix the two quite fruitfully and do some samatha and some vipassana. I don't think there's one size fits all, but different ways of doing it. One that works well for many people is to begin with mindfulness of breathing, and at some point during the session to deliberately make the switch to vipassana and deliberately start noticing things. You should, if you're working like this, you should be very clear about what you're doing. You don't want to be muddled and being sort of doing samatha, sort of doing vipassana. You need to make that switch consciously and deliberately, and don't be switching back and forth too often. And it's good to not neglect the walking meditation. That's very helpful. Generally, it's better to do the walking meditation first and then sit down. If you're going to do like one bit of each, to do the walking first. And the transition from walking to sitting is very important. You want to sit down as mindfully and as collectedly as possible. So if you're doing a series, like if you're on a retreat, or you're just taking a day of practice and you're doing a walk, a sit type of thing, if you've got any small little fussy things to do, like take a pee or drink some water or put some wood in the fire, you should do that stuff at the beginning of the walking period to get them out of the way, so that the later part of the walking period is uninterrupted, and you take it from the walking directly into the sitting. That's actually quite helpful, to follow that rule. So I don't want to talk for too long this evening. I just wanted to say a few words to kind of sum up the practice and the meditation, and we can have a cup of tea and I can answer a few questions. Okay.